The woman under the bed. Aisha, a 16-year-old girl, had to share a room with her sister, Rai, due to their large family. Like many siblings, they often had disagreements. Their most frequent fight was over ownership of their shared room's key. Each day, one of them would hold on to it. One evening, after a silly argument, Aisha stormed off to the kitchen to cool down. As usual, Rai locked the room behind her, a typical move. When she finally returned, she found the door locked, just as expected. Rai had vented her frustration by locking her out. But as she banged on the door, demanding Rai to open it, her sister yelled from downstairs.
Stop yelling, it's 1 a.m.
Aisha turned back to the door, utterly confused. If Rai was downstairs, then who was inside their room? She twisted the doorknob once more, and this time, the door swung open. The room was pitch dark, with the window wide open. Moonlight streamed in, casting an eerie glow as the thin white curtains swayed hauntingly in the wind. Something about the atmosphere made Aisha hesitate before stepping inside. She reached for the light switch, but before she could turn it on, her eyes landed on Rai's bed and she saw something horrifying. She looked toward the bunk bed. The darkness beneath it was thick, and from its shadows, a pale, bony hand with visible veins rested motionless on the floor, as if waiting for something. Someone was under the bed. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. It took her a few seconds to summon the courage to speak.
Who's there?
But the hand remained still, unmoving. She spoke again, louder this time.
If you don't come out, I'm calling the police.
That's when she heard a shrill giggle, a woman's voice. The hand slowly began to move, and a woman dressed in white crawled out from under the bed. Half of her face was scarred from burns, and she had no hair. Her bloodshot eyes glowed as she stood motionless in the room, like a terrifying statue. She began laughing strangely, humming a lullaby in a haunting, chilling tone. Aisha, terrified and unable to stay any longer, bolted out of the room, screaming for help. Gasping for breath, she told her family what she had seen, but most of them were skeptical. Still, her father grabbed a baseball bat and went back with her to check the room. When they returned to Aisha's room, it was empty. The window was still wide open. The woman was gone. But when they turned the lights back on, they saw muddy footprints stretching from the window to the bed. Aisha's father peered out the window. His face went pale as he saw a shadowy figure climbing down the drain pipe and vanishing into the darkness of the street. The family was left in shock and confusion, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Though there were no clear answers, Aisha remained haunted by a deep, lingering fear. For weeks, Aisha tried to convince herself that the woman under the bed was just an intruder. But the truth revealed itself in the most unexpected way. Weeks later, while cleaning out old belongings in the attic with her father, Aisha found an old family photo taken years ago. But standing faintly in the background was her, the woman from that night. Her father snatched the photo, gripping it so tightly that the edges crumpled.
Where did you find this?
He asked before finally revealing the truth. The woman had once been their housemaid many years ago, working for them for a long time. But one day, she disappeared without a trace, leaving no explanation, and the family never spoke of her again. And yet, after all these years, she had returned. Not to harm them, but for what reason? That question loomed over Aisha's mind. Her father refused to say anything more and started burning the photo, as if erasing any trace of the woman's existence. To this day, she still cannot forget the bloodshot eyes staring at her from under the bed. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one, but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
Did you forget something? Don't joke like that.
but no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining.
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there. Haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night. and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV, and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared, my hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. The madness of the masked man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it, but as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, A shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips as if daring her to approach.
Come outside, Susan.
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan, I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
Jeff?
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily. As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety. I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The 2 of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up, gasping for air. I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple: a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
Who's there?
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost.
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
This road isn't for wandering. You should leave.
He muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup. and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut, a place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with the sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, But things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
Look, Mark.
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night.
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, "Maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually." Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. The impersonator of the babysitter. Dylan was home alone, sitting on the couch in the living room, when his mom walked in with Joshua, a thin man who looked nervous. He was 12 years old and believed he was old enough to stay home alone, but his parents insisted on hiring a babysitter. Dylan immediately disliked Joshua, calling him a clumsy loser, a nerd in his head. Joshua tried to be friendly, but his anxiety was clear. His mom handed over the rules for the evening. Joshua had to make sure Dylan ate, didn't stay up too late, and didn't watch horror movies. But Dylan was determined to make everything difficult. He rolled his eyes and agreed reluctantly. Once they left, Dylan turned on a horror movie with gory scenes, deliberately trying to make Joshua uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching Joshua jump at every scare, his face growing paler with each moment. Dylan started suggesting Joshua order a pizza. He almost ran into the kitchen to get away from the TV screen, and Dylan couldn't stop laughing. While he was on the phone ordering, a new, wicked idea popped into Dylan's head. After a while, they got their pizza. But as Dylan observed, something was off in Joshua's behavior. He seemed too anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest noise. Dylan found this strange but shrugged it off, still focused on achieving his goal. Bored and wanting to scare the babysitter, Dylan suggested they play hide and seek in the dark. He thought Joshua would be desperate to escape the horror movie and agreed without hesitation. Things started to get strange. While in the bathroom, Dylan heard the doorbell ring, but he was a little surprised since the pizza was delivered so early. But when he stepped out, he saw Joshua staring at the front door with a scared expression, saying no one was there, and he thought it was the pizza delivery guy. The game started, and Joshua went to hide. Dylan found him after 5 minutes. Dylan asked,
"Why didn't you try hiding in the basement?"
Joshua said,
The dark scares me.
in Dylan's mind, the perfect plan continued to form. Joshua began pressing his face into the wall and counting, while Dylan hid, thoroughly enjoying his plan. The boy hid in the kitchen, secretly holding the TV remote, waiting for the perfect moment. As he started searching and approached the TV, the boy suddenly turned the volume all the way up, the sound of a terrifying scene, nearly giving him a heart attack. That was when the boy thought about hiding in his parents' closet to jump out and scare him. Dylan quietly tiptoed towards the bedroom, opened the closet, and that's when everything went still. Inside the closet was a dead body. It was a man with his head wrapped in a plastic bag, seemingly suffocated. Dylan, in a panic, tried to understand the situation, and suddenly I noticed a wallet sticking out of the man's pocket. The boy reached for it. He found an ID card that read Joshua Miller. If his babysitter, Joshua Miller, was dead in the closet, then the boy had no idea who he was playing hide and seek with. There was a killer in his house. He quickly ran under the bed, trying to steady his breath so the man wouldn't hear him breathing. A pair of feet entered and stopped right in front of the open closet.
Congratulations. It seems like you found your babysitter,
He said. Dylan realized that the game he had set up just minutes ago had now turned into a survival mission, as his life depended on it. The man pretending to be Joshua revealed himself to be Kyle. He had planned to trap Joshua for killing the boy, and now he intended to kill Dylan as well. His face suddenly dipped under the bed, and he screamed.
"It's your turn to be like Joshua."
Dylan, in a final desperate moment, ran out from under the bed. Kyle chased him, lunging at him with a knife. The blade ripped his shirt, but luckily it missed.
"I thought you liked horror movies."
He mocked the boy.
"This is your real-life horror movie, kid."
Dylan fearfully ran into a room and locked the door. Then he heard the doorbell. Through the window, he saw it was the pizza delivery person. Dylan shouted for help.
Call 911 right now.
But before the pizza guy could assess the situation, Joshua ran downstairs, opened the door, and charged at him with a knife. The pizza guy was stronger. After a struggle, he managed to pin Kyle down and snatched the knife from his hand. Kyle was convicted of murder. Dylan's parents rushed home after being contacted by the police. They were also grateful and gave the pizza guy a sum of money to thank him for saving the boy. Dylan's parents never left him alone with anyone again. Whenever they had to go out, he stayed with his grandmother. They would never hire a babysitter again. The horror Dylan experienced that night would stay with him forever. The possession of the red dress. Ben, my best friend, and I went to a remote lakeside campground for a quiet weekend of fishing. The night air was cold, peaceful, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the water. We were enjoying this calm together. I suggested grilling the fish, and Ben agreed to gather firewood. He went to the forest's edge to find some. Along the way, he found a lot of dry branches scattered around, but then he saw something red in the darkness. As he got closer, he discovered a red dress. After a while, Ben returned with a bundle of firewood wrapped in the red dress. He intended to use it to start the fire, but I didn't pay much attention or think twice about using it as kindling. Not long after, we chatted while waiting for the fish to cook, but after a few seconds, Ben's face suddenly changed. When he stopped speaking, he made a strange noise from his throat. His attitude shifted, becoming oddly restless. Ben's eyes grew wild, and he suddenly became aggressively irrational. He grabbed the fish from the fire and started devouring it, even though it was still raw, as if he found it irresistibly delicious. I didn't understand why he was acting like that, but I was concerned the fish wasn't cooked. I decided to stop Ben from eating it all, fearing it might make him sick. Ben suddenly went berserk, yelling at me to give him the fish. That's when I realized something terrible had happened. Ben seemed to have lost his mind and control. Panicking, I had to restrain my friend. Eventually, I managed to calm Ben down, and he fell asleep. I was about to leave, planning to take him to the hospital to make sure he was okay. Since the situation seemed to have passed, I decided to take Ben home. It looked like it might rain, so we quickly left. It started pouring heavily. As I drove back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had been awakened by the red dress. Ben went home to his wife, but things got worse. That night, Ben started sleepwalking, something he had never done before. In the late hours, his wife was awakened by a strange noise. She saw him rummaging through the closet. He kept saying, "Wait for me," throwing clothes around, not responding to his wife, until he found his wife's red dress in the closet. Ben pulled it out and stared at it for a moment, then decided to put it on and went to bed. as if nothing had happened. His wife assumed he was just sleepwalking, so she said nothing. Ben's wife noticed that things were becoming increasingly strange since Ben went fishing with me, so she came to me for help. I returned to the lake, hoping to uncover or find something. I built a large fire to keep wild animals away from the old campsite. I returned to the old campsite. I was shocked to see that the dress was torn and scorched, yet still strangely intact, as if it had been deliberately left there. I realized the rain must have put out the fire that day. I walked through the forest to the places near where we had fished. Then my gaze was drawn to a rope tied to a tree branch, as if marking something. I approached and stumbled upon a corner of a notebook lying on the ground near the base of a tree, as though someone had buried it there. The journal revealed the tragic story of a woman named Elena, who had lived in the forest many years ago. She was known for wearing the same red dress, a gift from her lover. However, her love turned to jealousy and obsession, and after a tragic incident, she was murdered by him. Elena's spirit, bound to the red dress, sought to take the souls of others to keep her company in the afterlife. The dress served as a conduit for the spirit, and those who interacted with it would become vessels for her rage and obsession. I returned to the same spot. Ben was now kneeling at the base of the tree, staring at the scorched red dress. Then he reached for it. Ben suddenly lunged at me, becoming more aggressive like a beast. I struggled to overpower him to get the dress. I tried to wrestle Ben off to get the dress. Desperate, I grabbed the red dress and threw it into the fire I had built earlier. This time, I had to make sure it burned completely. As the dress burned, Ben collapsed to the ground, his face twisted in agony, as if he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. Ben's eyes were filled with confusion and horror as he stared at the dress still burning. In the days that followed, Ben tried to return to normal life, but he remained haunted by the red dress and the woman in the forest. Every time he saw the color red, he became terrified. After everything that happened, I too was affected by what I had witnessed, but I tried to forget it, believing the worst was finally behind us. The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob. trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. The mysterious house in the deep forest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. Nick sat in the chair, lost in thought. He remembered what he had gone through and seemed unable to escape that feeling. In the late 80s, Nick and his friend Ken, both experienced hikers, decided to take a different route from their usual long-distance trails. They passed through the woods behind the farm, intrigued by a nearby ranch that raised exotic animals like cassowaries, strange and out of place in the countryside. They ventured deeper into the forest, the trees becoming denser as they moved further from familiar grounds. The air was filled with a damp smell as they pushed through thick underbrush, their excitement gradually building. As they continued walking, they strayed off the path and came upon an old, dilapidated house neither of them had seen before. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Just looking at the house gave Nick an ominous feeling, but they couldn't resist their purpose, to explore, so they naturally decided to go inside and check it out. Inside, the house had a very classic style, probably built in the late 40s or early 50s. But Ken saw and witnessed something even more terrifying. There were writings and symbols in strange, Latin-like languages about a worship ritual believed to be satanic or pagan. Some of the images depicted how to sacrifice human souls to an entity believed to be demonic, leaving them in disbelief. Kin exclaimed, as it was the first time he'd seen anything like it. To this day, and even at that moment, Nick still insists that some of the symbols painted on the walls were not merely red paint. The kitchen was cramped, and there was a narrow staircase leading upstairs. It was so tight that their shoulders would brush against the walls as they ascended. As they climbed the stairs, Nick felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He glanced back, but saw only Kin behind him. Kin stopped midway, frozen in place, insisting that he had seen a shadow dart across the stairs above. Nick forced a smile to reassure him, even though he too felt something was off. Their fear seemed to be increasingly palpable. The upstairs was pitch dark, with a room at the end of a narrow hallway. Leading to it were strange, dried red streaks that looked like blood seeping into the floor. As soon as they entered the room, they were confronted with many similar strange symbols. What caught their attention was the sight of chains with handcuffs hanging from the walls, as if someone had tried to lock something or someone in this very room. Then, the faint sound of chains clinking filled the room. The chains hanging on the walls began to sway, as if moved by an unseen force, despite the windows being tightly shut and no breeze present. Suddenly, they heard a noise, footsteps approaching from behind, resembling the sound of heels tapping on wood, quickly ascending the stairs behind them. Terrified, they ran down the stairs, but found no one there. The house fell silent once again, except for their labored breathing. There were no new footprints, only the ones they had left when they entered. Too frightened to stay, they decided to leave the house. But no matter which direction they took or how they used the compass, they tried it more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet, they always ended up standing in front of the house's main door. They tried again and again, walking in every conceivable direction, but the result was always the same. Caught in a disorienting and seemingly hopeless loop, they became utterly exhausted and terrified. Standing before the house one final time, they were met with something far worse. At that moment, Kin nearly fainted before looking up and pointing to the front-facing window on the second floor of the house. Nick and Kin crouched, frozen in fear. There it was, a figure. Yes, they both saw it. A tall, shadowy woman stood at the window, staring at them. Though they couldn't discern her facial features, her large, dark eyes were unmistakable. Then, she vanished instantly. Overcome with terror, they ran as fast as they could through the forest, eventually stopping at the edge of a federal road about 3 miles from the house. To this day, they still don't know how they managed to find their way back. It felt like a miracle. 5 years later, Nick and Kin decided to return to the house. But this time, when they arrived, the house had completely collapsed, leaving only rubble and debris. Nick later stumbled upon an online article about the house. Don was a man with unusual behavior. He had locked his mother in the attic and abused her for years, then used the house for his own sinister purposes. The weight of the truth slowly sank into Nick as he learned about the story and the dark history behind it. Now looking back, Nick realized that some things are better left buried, and some houses should never be revisited. Seeking the truth. The city never sleeps, and Kevin does his best to make a living as a night shift taxi driver. He is a hard-working and kind man. One foggy night, as Kevin followed his usual route, he turned a corner onto a quiet, nearly deserted street and saw her. A woman stood alone under the flickering glow of a street lamp. She was dressed in black, her long hair hanging loose, and her pale hand raised to hail his taxi. Something about her seemed off, but Kevin's job wasn't to ask questions, it was to drive. The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, handing him a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled address. The address was unfamiliar to him and seemed unsettling. As they drove through increasingly deserted streets, Kevin tried to make conversation, but she remained coldly silent. When they finally arrived, a decaying, abandoned house on the edge of a forest loomed in the darkness. Kevin stopped the car, unease building as he turned to tell her they had arrived and mentioned the fare. Then Kevin turned around to find the back seat empty. The door was shut, and the woman was gone, as though she had never been there. No money, no sound, no trace. Confusion mixed with a hint of anger as he stared into the darkness. He chalked it up to a strange, unlucky night and drove away, determined to forget it. A few days later, Kevin was driving through the city again. Once more, he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She looked eerily familiar. The dress, the posture, the loose hair. Was it the same woman? Kevin wasn't sure. He hadn't paid close attention to her face last time. But this time, she seemed different. She was clutching her stomach as if injured or ill. Her face was pale and strained, as though in great pain. She looked like she was struggling to stay upright. Kevin hesitated, memories of the previous encounter surfacing, but he couldn't ignore her distress and slowly pulled over. He parked by the curb and rolled down the window.
Are you okay?
She didn't answer, her lips trembling, but after a moment, she slowly looked up. The woman's gaze met his briefly, her wide, haunting eyes struggling to utter a single whispered word.
Help!
Kevin wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. He told her to get in and said he would take her where she needed to go. She quietly got into the car, her breathing shallow and labored, but she said nothing more. Her presence was icy. She handed him a piece of paper. It was an address near the edge of the forest, close to the previous location. An eerie coincidence. This time, the destination was a hospital instead of an old house. The ride was bizarre. Occasionally, he glanced at her, her hand pressed tightly against her stomach, but she remained utterly still. Her breathing was nearly inaudible, like the distant whisper of the wind, hollow and empty. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped the car, but a cold breeze brushed his ear, sending chills down his spine.
Help me!
A cold draft swept into the car, making him shiver. When Kevin turned around, the woman was gone. The rear door was wide open, and the seat she had occupied was empty.
What the hell is happening?
The woman's sudden disappearance left him frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His hands trembled as he locked the doors, quickly started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Back at home, Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. Questions gnawed at him. Who was that woman? How did she disappear? And why did she lead him there? Something strange was going on. After days of pondering, Kevin couldn't shake the fear tormenting him. He returned to the hospital, hoping to find answers. He asked the staff about the woman he had seen, but no one seemed to know anything about her. But after all that, he found no leads. In his moment of despair, he suddenly saw the shadow of the woman he had seen before. She was standing at the end of the hospital corridor, and the place felt eerily empty, save for the two of them. Unable to explain why, he followed her to a locker belonging to a man. The name on the locker read Dr. Don. He had no idea what this meant. Was there a connection between her and this man? Moments later, Kevin was still standing in the hallway, but she was gone. Instead, the usual sounds of hospital staff working, patients moving, and the general hum of life returned. Everything seemed normal again. As Kevin contemplated leaving, unsure of who this Dr. Don was, A nurse's voice called out from behind him, "Dr. Don." He froze and turned to see a tall, slender doctor with a beard and glasses that gave him an air of intellect. Kevin noticed that the people around seemed to hold him in high regard. Kevin questioned himself. Was there anything suspicious about a man like that? He certainly didn't seem the type. Still, Kevin decided to sit and observe. Dr. Don stepped out of his office and headed toward the exit. Kevin quietly followed until the doctor turned around to look at him. The doctor didn't appear worried at all and spoke in a calm, composed voice.
Hello, can I help you with something?
Kevin, feeling flustered, lied and said he was visiting his girlfriend here. Kevin deflected by glancing at his name tag.
Dr. Don, this is my first time seeing you. You seem well liked.
The doctor smiled politely and excused himself, but Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kevin returned to the corridor, beginning to feel ridiculous and questioning if he was taking things too far. Then, the woman appeared again at the end of the hallway. A whisper close to his ear said,
Help me, please.
Kevin froze, but the encounter reinforced his resolve. Maybe it was time to follow his instincts. Dr. Don's silhouette was retreating. Kevin decided to follow him cautiously, and, strangely, Dr. Don was heading toward the very house the woman had led him to before. The old, decaying, and completely isolated house. The windows of the house were nearly boarded up. After a while, Dr. Don left the house through the front door, locking it behind him. Kevin pressed himself against a pile of wood nearby to avoid being seen. Once Dr. Don was out of sight, Kevin crept to the back of the house and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Opening it cautiously, Kevin stepped inside. Inside was a mess of decay and foul odors. Rubber gloves, small glass jars, and scraps of fabric were scattered across the floor, along with dark, dried stains. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he heard sounds coming from a room not far away. The door was shut tight and locked. Breaking it open would cause a loud noise and be extremely risky. Suddenly, she appeared again, standing next to a cabinet. Her eyes locked onto Kevin before shifting toward the cabinet. It revealed a key hidden behind the shelf. In an instant, she vanished once more, perhaps guiding Kevin. Just as Kevin reached for the key, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he hid in a small cabinet, barely fitting inside before Dr. Don returned. Through the crack of the cabinet door, Kevin saw him open the room and drag out a heavy bag. The doctor retrieved a syringe and a small glass vial, proceeding to do something suspicious. A creak inadvertently escaped from the cabinet where Kevin was hiding. Dr. Don put his tools down and approached the cabinet. Kevin held his breath, preparing for the worst. As Dr. Don got closer, Kevin realized he had no escape. Seizing the moment, he burst out, pushing the doctor to the ground before dashing into the forest behind the house. Dr. Don chased after Kevin. At the edge of the forest, Kevin managed to call the police. As they ran deeper into the woods, Kevin's years of experience in the wilderness began to pay off. His eyes caught a marked tree stump. He remembered traps he had learned about as a child, the kind hunters used for animals. It was a net trap leading to a concealed pit. Kevin stopped, carefully observing and calculating. Dr. Don approached with a scalpel in hand.
You know too much. This will be quick, he sneered.
As he neared the trap, Kevin deliberately moved slowly, calmly observing. Suddenly, Kevin jumped aside. Dr. Don lunged forward, oblivious to the trap. Bam! A loud snap echoed as he fell into the concealed pit, screaming in pain. Shortly after, the police arrived and uncovered the horrifying events that had taken place in the house. Dr. Don's past was plagued by an abusive father. He had built a facade of respectability, but was, in reality, a monster. He would overdose his patients with drugs and record their suffering while laughing maniacally. Many had met unjust ends at the hands of this madman. The woman Kevin had seen was found deceased at the scene. She had sought help, likely for her sister, who had also been held captive in the same house. They had both uncovered Dr. Don's depravity. Kevin was haunted by everything he had experienced. He wondered how many others like her had wandered into the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to help before it was too late. In the end, though, Dr. Don finally faced justice. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing. I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time. darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. The ghost of a mother in the forest. I was never someone who truly believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just products of imagination, created to explain the unexplainable. But everything changed when I was in that cursed forest. It was supposed to be a normal overnight trip, and quite an easy one. The locals whispered about the forest being haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The road was rough, and the darkness grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights barely cut through the fog, so I had to be more careful. Then suddenly, she appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the road, hunched over, her eyes fixed on me as I stopped. I honked, but she didn't seem to hear, so I opened the door and shouted for her to move so I could pass. She didn't react at all. Instead, she slowly turned, looked straight at me, and asked, "Have you seen my daughter?" She kept asking, her voice growing more desperate. Then suddenly walked away, sobbing, leaving me confused and shaking. In my mind, I tried to dismiss the encounter with the woman as I continued my journey, but her words kept echoing in my head, gnawing at my sanity. When I finally made it out of the forest at dawn, I stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper was kind, and I chatted with him for a while. But as I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the forest, staring at me. Fear started to creep in, and that's when the shopkeeper told me about her. He said that she had lost her mind after a tragic accident and now wanders the forest, searching for her long-lost daughter. I dismissed the story again, thinking it was just a coincidence. That night, as I drove back through the forest, the rain started pouring down heavily, making the road more dangerous. But I kept going, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, through the rain, I saw another woman. But this time, she wasn't alone, and in her arms was a child who looked frail, almost lifeless. I intended to drive past. I hesitated, but my conscience wouldn't let me. I stopped and asked if they needed a ride. She looked pale, like she'd been out in the rain for too long. She nodded gratefully and climbed into my car with the child in her arms. I handed them a towel to dry off, and then she directed me to a hospital. When we arrived, she quietly thanked me before heading into the building. I sighed with relief, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the back of the car. It was the black umbrella she had been carrying. It was still in my car, and when I turned to look back at the hospital, I was almost paralyzed with what I saw. I looked away for just a few seconds, and when I looked back, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the rain. Feeling confused, I decided it was best to leave as soon as possible. As I neared home, the rain was still pouring, and the parking lot was quite far from my house, so I had to use the black umbrella left in my truck. However, I felt a bit hesitant to use it, remembering that it belonged to the woman and her son, but I had no other choice. As I was walking, a strong gust of wind almost tore the umbrella from my hand, and suddenly, a wooden beam came crashing down from above, about to fall on me. It could have killed me, but the umbrella somehow pulled me to the side, saving my life. Shaking, I realized the umbrella wasn't just an ordinary umbrella. Perhaps it was a gift the woman left behind to protect me. The next morning, I went back to the grocery store, determined to uncover the truth. The shopkeeper hesitated, but finally told me the whole story. The woman and her child were spirits, doomed to wander the forest after a tragic accident. She died trying to protect her son. It happened on a stormy night when she was shunned and refused help by passing travelers. Some even splashed her with mud. She used her body to shield the child, but unfortunately, she slipped and fell off a cliff. On rainy days, if drivers refused to give her a ride, she would mysteriously appear in their cars and haunt them. Feeling a deep sense of injustice, she continues to seek out and punish those who don't help them. The old woman, unable to bear the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandson, went mad shortly after. Since that horrific accident, the villagers have often seen her holding a black umbrella, muttering nonsense. With a heavy heart, I visited their graves, returned the umbrella, and expressed my gratitude. As I walked away, I knew my life had changed forever. I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, and from that day on, I would never doubt their existence again. Night at the gas station. That night, snow fell, freezing cold. The wind howled as I drove into the parking lot of the gas station where I worked the night shift. I had been doing this job for a few months now, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., as it fit my personal schedule. My coworker's car was the only other vehicle in the lot. I parked next to it, bracing myself for a long night. Nothing but slow hours and an empty store ahead. After greeting my coworker and taking over his shift, I was alone for the rest of the night. As soon as the door closed behind him, I glanced at the task list my manager had left. It was short, just a few tasks that would take less than an hour to complete. Around midnight, a car pulled into the station, catching my attention. It was an old SUV, pulling up to one of the gas pumps. I glanced out the window for a moment before turning back to my phone. A few minutes passed, then 10. I glanced again, surprised to see the SUV still parked there. The headlights were off, the doors closed, but no one had come in to pay or use the restroom. A strange feeling began to creep over me. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the freezing cold, the wind biting into my skin. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the SUV. I peered through the window, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" But from what I could see through the frosted glass, the car was empty. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the growing unease. There was no one in the SUV. But why would someone leave a car parked there, engine off, in freezing temperatures like this? I glanced down and noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They led away from the car, but not toward the front of the station. Instead, they extend toward the corner of the gas station. It was too cold for someone to just walk off and disappear like that. I hurried back inside to warm up. Once inside, I turned on the small heater next to the counter. Then a loud noise came from the back of the building. I turned around, looking through the rows of shelves in the station. Empty, nothing there. Slowly, I started walking toward the noise coming from the back of the gas station. There on the floor were small puddles of dirty water, the kind that could only come from melted snow. I followed the trail, leading me to the storage room in the back. I stopped at the door, and in the dim light of the storage room, I saw a figure half hidden among the shelves. He was standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard that gave him a disheveled, intimidating look. He was staring right at me. I stood frozen, trembling. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? Then he moved slightly, stepping forward. Instinctively, I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to defend myself with. My fingers touched a metal crowbar leaning against the wall. I gripped it tightly. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" But he didn't answer. As I raised the crowbar, the cold metal felt heavy in my hand. I warned him, telling him to back off or I'd call the police. He took another step forward. I screamed louder in desperation, "I'm warning you." I swung the crowbar through the air. He staggered back, slipping on the wet floor. He groaned, clutching his leg as if he twisted it in pain. The opportunity was there, and I didn't miss it. I bolted back to the front of the store. I ran to the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I picked up the store phone and whispered to 911 for help. Every second felt like an hour as I waited, my eyes locked on the storage room door. When the police arrived, I pointed them to the back. 2 officers cautiously entered, flashlights raised as they swept the storage room. I expected to hear them shout out, telling me they'd found him, but instead, they emerged with puzzled looks on their faces. They found wet footprints leading out the back door, disappearing into the snow-covered forest behind the gas station. They followed the trail, but the vast, dark expanse seemed to swallow everything. He had vanished, leaving only a mystery. The SUV had been towed away. I still work the night shift, but every time I hear a noise from the back or see a car pull into the station, I get more cautious. He could be out there, watching, waiting. But one thing is certain, I was lucky to survive that night. Night at the gas station, the return. The memory of that snowy night still lingers in my mind. It's been over 2 weeks, and the police are still searching for him. Since then, unease has stayed with me. I've become more cautious, more aware of every detail. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. Light snow fell tonight, and the parking lot was empty. No cars, no customers, only the constant hum of the station lights and the heater struggling to keep the cold at bay. I gazed out the window, just like I had every night since then. I decided to keep busy with the small tasks my manager had left me. Stocking shelves, wiping the counter, anything to keep my mind occupied. As I bent down to organize some snacks, I heard it. A soft creaking sound from the back. It was the same sound I had heard that night, the one that led me to the storage room. I stood up slowly, waiting, listening for more. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I began to relax, headlights swept across the parking lot. A car slowly pulled in. It was the same type of SUV again. I froze, watching it stop near the gas pump. I grabbed my coat, knowing I couldn't avoid this. A feeling of dread crept over me as if everything was about to happen again. I stepped outside, the cold wind biting my face as I approached the SUV. I cautiously peered inside. This time, there was someone inside. A man wearing a thick coat, his face partially obscured by a knit hat. I asked, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond right away. He slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate. Then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "I am here for what I left behind." Before I could respond, he opened the car door and stepped out. He was tall and moved toward me, and instinctively, I took a step back. I ran inside, slamming the door shut. My fingers fumbled for my phone to call the police. I gasped as I told them, "He's back. The man from before. Please send help." I glanced around, looking for the crowbar I had used before. It was leaning against the wall near the counter. I grabbed it tightly as I heard the man approach the entrance. The door rattled as he tried the handle, but it was locked. Then I heard him move toward the back door. I crept toward the storage room. The back door was still shut, but I knew he was out there. I could hear him moving, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Suddenly, the door handle began to shake. I backed away, gripping the crowbar. The door creaked open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air. I could see his silhouette. It was still him. The scruffy beard, the broad shoulders. His eyes fixed on me, wild and crazed. This time, I didn't wait. I swung the crowbar. He ducked, barely dodging the blow. I swung again, and this time, I hit his arm. He groaned in pain, staggering back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged at me, grabbing the crowbar with a force I didn't expect. The metal slipped from my hands and fell to the ground. I stumbled back. Then I saw my chance the exit, and I ran as fast as I could toward it. I ran outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I could hear him behind me. I sprinted toward the forest, needing to get away from him. Branches whipped against my face as I rushed into the woods, the cold biting into my skin, causing sharp pain. I tripped. My foot caught in a tree root hidden beneath the snow. It sapped all the strength out of me. I tried to get up, but before I could move, I felt his hand grab my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked out, sending him staggering with a cry of pain. I got up and kept running toward the edge of the woods. In the distance, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, pointing toward the forest. "He's still in there." At that moment, he came running out of the woods as the police closed in. For a split second, the crazed smile on his face vanished. He turned to run, but it was too late. The police were right in front of him. He thrashed and squirmed violently as they wrestled him to the ground and cuffed him. The SUV had been towed away, and the man was gone, but the unease remained. The store was quiet again. I walked to the door, staring out at the now empty parking lot. I didn't know why he had come back, what he was after, or what he thought he'd left behind, but I hoped it would be the last time I saw him. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, and sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mockingly, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over. You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloody child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering. Sell your soul to the devil. Alex had been acting strangely lately, distant, and his band had temporarily suspended him. His obsession with fame had clouded his mind. He began hearing stories and watching about certain pacts, something involving the other world to achieve his desires, though he laughed it off as if it were a joke someone had made up. Instruments echoed through the empty practice room. Alex had practiced for weeks with frustration, but it was never enough for him. He felt drained and wanted more. Alex always craved fame, attention, admiration. When one of his friends mentioned an old tale about selling one's soul for success, Alex didn't believe it, but his curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to dig deeper. Alex followed directions to the old chapel on campus. It was considered unholy, rumored to be cursed. Following the instructions, Alex arrived at a room in the crumbling building at the end of the hall. Following the instructions, he stood in a circle with ancient symbols and recited the words 3 times. A faint, cold laugh echoed around him, filling the room. His flashlight flickered, then went out, leaving him in darkness. Suddenly, he heard a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving toward him from the shadows. From the far end of the hallway, a figure emerged, a woman with long, tangled hair, a pale, lifeless face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing blood-stained teeth and hollow, dark eye sockets. Alex stumbled backward, falling as she moved closer, each step punctuated by the sickening sound of dripping blood on the floor. As she neared him, she raised a gnarled, bloody hand in front of him, her fingers long and skeletal. ending in sharp claws. Before he could react, she touched his forehead, and a sharp pain shot through his skull. The room around him spun, as if he were falling into a void. Alex was suspended in darkness, drifting with no sense of direction, pulled through a series of horrifying visions. He saw himself on stage, surrounded by a crowd. At first, there was applause, but soon the cheers turned to boos and mockery. Alex's guitar string snapped, cutting into his finger. Blood oozed from his hand as he struggled to keep playing. In another vision, he was alone in a dimly lit room, exhausted and isolated. A mirror reflected Alex's gaunt, aged, haunted face. Dark circles framed his eyes. He looked down at his bruised, scarred hands and tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The visions shifted again, and now he was surrounded by shadows, spirits whispering his name, accusing him, blaming him. Their faces twisted in agony, their fingers reaching out, clawing and dragging him down into the darkness. The images faded, and Alex returned to the hall, lying on the floor. His body ached, as if he had truly endured every wound, every suffering he had just witnessed. He staggered to his feet, the ghostly woman standing just a few centimeters away, her eyes now dark, hollow, and infinite. She leaned in close to Alex, whispering in his mind, promising fame, but at the cost of a life filled with suffering, loneliness, and despair. Drops of blood splattered from her mouth onto the floor, staining Alex's shoes red. He stumbled back, shaking his head, his determination seemingly shattered at the sight. He wasn't brave enough for this. Then she lunged forward in anger. Her claws sank into his chest, piercing through, but with excruciating pain. His scream died in his throat as he was thrown backward, crashing to the floor with an impact that shook him to his bones. Then he was alone again, lying in the empty hallway. Alex staggered to his feet and rushed out. The sky brightened as Alex dashed through the main gate. He clutched his chest, her ghostly claws still imprinted on his skin. Fame turned bitter with fear. He didn't realize she had stolen a part of his soul, leaving his mind to be manipulated by dark thoughts like a puppet on strings. As the days passed and Alex's demeanor grew colder, his voice, once warm and welcoming, now took on a distant, almost haunted tone. People began to avoid him, no longer recognizing the Alex they once knew. A few weeks later, Alex returned to the rehearsal room. As if by a dark instinct, he began seducing other young musicians who, like him, craved fame and admiration. Some people laughed, like he had, but a few were intrigued, curiosity filling their eyes. At midnight, Alex leads a handful of curious people to the cursed old chapel. As they repeat the ritual, one by one, they experience the horrors Alex endured, haunted by images of suffering and despair. Then, Alex turned back alone, his figure fading into the dark hallway, leaving them there. Alex's mind was now a maze of distorted thoughts, controlled and manipulated by a monster. Puppets do dark things. Mysterious man on the cruise ship. Our large family gathered for dinner, celebrating my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. The ship was filled with laughter and chatter as we enjoyed dinner on the last night of our cruise. This was my first time on a cruise. My sister, cousins, and I were incredibly excited, running around the ship. After dinner, the adults stayed behind to play and chat, while the kids headed up to the deck to enjoy the quiet night, eager to experience one last bit of adventure before bed. The night was perfect. The sky was covered in a blanket of stars, clearer and more than anywhere I had ever seen before. The ship glided gently through the dark waters as we lounged on the deck, sharing scary stories, but that peace was quickly shattered. Around 11:30 p.m., we decided to head to the game room, and I noticed him a solitary figure sitting near the railing. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair sticking out from under a winter hat. Despite the warm night air, his long coat seemed out of place, and his head tilted slightly, as if he were either sleeping or staring out to sea. I was the last to pass by him, and as I walked by, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder to watch him. He remained still, but then I heard his voice. It was more of a mumble, deep and fragmented, almost inaudible over the sound of the ship gliding through the water. When I turned back, the man was standing up. He took a step towards me, his face now only partially illuminated by the dim lights on the deck, gaunt, with deep-set eyes in the darkness. In his outstretched hand, he held something and asked if I wanted to buy it. I looked down at what he was holding, a small, crude voodoo doll, with button eyes sewn on and limbs twisted unnaturally. I gasped, and without thinking further, I declined and left for the bright, noisy game room, a stark contrast to the eerie silence above. Suddenly, the door leading into the game room creaked open. I felt a chilling sea breeze brush against my skin. I turned back and saw him there. The tall man from the deck had followed me inside. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. I didn't wait for him to approach and urged my sister and cousins to leave the area. We hurried out of the game room, making our way towards the lounge where the adults were chatting and playing. Once inside, my parents kissed us goodnight, and we began to head back to our room to prepare for bed. The room was small but cozy. I lay on the bed, the soothing sound of the engine lulling us into a sense of safety. I tried to forget the man's face, the way he stared at me, the strange voodoo doll he tried to sell. The gentle rocking of the ship quickly put us to sleep, but it didn't last long. Around 1 a.m., I was jolted awake by a horrifying scream. It was my sister. When I turned on the light, I saw him there. The man from the deck was sitting in the corner of our room, hunched over one of the chairs, his knees nearly touching his chin due to his height. Then he slowly stood up. Before we could react, he stumbled over his own feet, crashing into the bathroom. I ran over and slammed the bathroom door shut. We quickly barricaded the door with a chair. We screamed for help. Our parents rushed over and immediately called for ship security, who arrived within minutes, hands ready to cuff. The security team opened the bathroom door, dragging the tall man out. His eyes were wild, and he mumbled incoherently, his long limbs flailing awkwardly as they restrained him. We later learned that the man was not a registered passenger on the ship. He wasn't on the manifest, and no one could figure out how he got on board. They suspected he had some sort of mental disorder. When they tried to question him, he barely responded, and they locked him in a holding cell below deck for the remainder of the trip. I returned to my room and lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Even though the man was now locked below deck, an unsettling anxiety still enveloped me. Hours passed, and sleep came in short, restless bursts. I jolted awake again, this time to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again, a faint dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a slow creaking. My heart raced. It was coming from the bathroom. I sat up, my hands gripping the edge of the bed. The bathroom door was ajar, and I stared at it, but there was nothing, just the open door and a chilling silence. I gathered my courage and swung my legs off the bed. I slowly walked toward the bathroom. As I reached the door, my hand trembled. I pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, but on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a voodoo doll. I gasped, stumbling back. The doll was still there, its stitched eyes seeming to glare at me from the floor. I bent down, hesitating before picking it up. The doll was made of coarse, dirty fabric, its stitching uneven, and it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried something dark. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, just like before when the man had given it to me on the deck. as if the doll itself were alive, trying to say something to me. I dropped the doll, my hand trembling. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a cold gust of wind swept through, even though no windows were open. My breath quickened as I stared, frozen in place. The doll began to move. It slowly slid across the floor, getting closer to my bed. Then suddenly, my bedroom door swung open, revealing the tall man standing in the doorway, his gaunt figure silhouetted by the dim hallway light. His eyes no longer held the wildness they once had. Instead, they were empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered as if responding to an unseen force. The man took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. In a panic, I pushed the man with all my strength, and to my surprise, he fell to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. But even as he lay there, motionless, the doll continued to move. Without hesitation, I grabbed the doll and ran to the window. My hands trembled as I tried to open it, but eventually, I managed to. The cold night air rushed in, and with all my strength, I threw the doll into the sea. The doll vanished into the dark waters below, swallowed by the depths of the ocean. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers ceased, the lights flickered once more, and then everything fell still. The man on the floor suddenly vanished, his form seemingly dissolving into the air in an inexplicable manner. We stood there, stunned, unsure of what had just happened. I fell to the floor, trembling. Perhaps it was all over. The nightmare was finally over. The next morning, we packed up our things and left the room without looking back. When I reached the desk, the cruise staff looked puzzled as we recounted our encounter with the man, who had been found dead right there for no apparent reason. It had happened suddenly. I sensed that he and that doll had some connection that I couldn't comprehend. As I stepped off the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man, whatever he was, and the doll carried something dark, and that we were the targets. I could still feel its chilling touch on my skin, and deep down, I knew we had escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. The hitchhiker's nightmare. The chilly spring air bit at my skin. It was a quiet night as I left the Subway restaurant. The shopping mall where the Subway was located was desolate, except for a few dim streetlights casting pale circles of light over the empty parking lot. Though the place was somewhat old and empty, the quality was decent, and it was only a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house. As I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man walking past the stores. He was tall, disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a dingy t-shirt. As he passed by the window, he glanced at me. It was only a brief look, but something about him left me feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy. I pushed open the door, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking the short distance to my car. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were faint, but they quickly grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from earlier. He was walking toward me, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. I stopped, unsure of what he wanted. He was too close for comfort. He asked me for a ride to the gas station just down the street. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as he pointed toward a gas station nearby, visible from where we stood. It didn't seem far, and it was on my way home. Though I hesitated, the cold air and his seemingly urgent demeanor convinced me to agree. I got into my car, and the man sat in the passenger seat. I drove out of the parking lot, down the empty streets, making the short drive to the gas station. Neither of us said a word. The entire time, something felt off about the situation. I kept telling myself everything was fine, it was just a quick ride, after all. When we arrived at the gas station, I parked in the back of the lot. I expected him to get out right away, but he didn't. Seconds passed in uncomfortable silence, and my anxiety grew. I said, "All right, we're here," trying to sound casual, hoping he would leave, but he didn't move. The man stared straight ahead, making no move to get out of the car. My heart started pounding as I repeated myself, this time more firmly. "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" Finally, he spoke. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly, but cold, almost irritated. He told me this wasn't the right gas station, and that he needed to go to a different one farther away. I glanced at the gas station in front of us, confused and worried. I was sure this was the place he pointed to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told him I wasn't going any farther and that I needed to go home. The man didn't reply. He just sat there, silent. The tension in the car was building, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I asked him to get out, my voice now shaky. He refused and said no. I glanced around the gas station, looking for someone who might help. A few cars were parked under the bright lights, but I didn't dare move. He seemed stubborn, and I was scared he might harm me. I felt trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in on me. Suddenly, a noise broke the tension, a car door slamming nearby. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a woman stepping out of her car, walking toward the gas station store. Seeing someone else, even from a distance, gave me a brief surge of courage. I turned back to him, my voice stronger this time. "I need you to get out of my car, right now." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he wouldn't get out until I took him where he needed to go. I couldn't take him anywhere else, and I couldn't sit there any longer with the fear gnawing at me. I glanced back at the gas station, hoping someone would look my way, but no one did. I needed an exit, and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to act as casual as possible. I said, "Okay," to buy myself some time, pretending to check the GPS for the other gas station he claimed he wanted to go to. He said nothing, but his eyes never left me. As my hand fumbled for the phone in my pocket, I could feel his gaze, watching my every move. My heart raced as I unlocked my phone, pretending to look up directions. In reality, I was opening the keypad. My mind raced, calculating how quickly I could call for help without him noticing. But before I could act, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my wrist. Panic exploded in my chest. He squeezed my wrist painfully as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. I tried to pull away, but he held me tight. His voice was cold, threatening, telling me not to even think about it. I froze. My breath became shallow as I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. The gas station lights cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more terrifying. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car pulling into the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the parking lot. The other man must have seen it too, because his hand suddenly loosened my wrist. Without warning, he let go of my wrist, opened the door, and got out of the car. He didn't look back, just walked quickly into the darkness behind the gas station. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me, but I was too shaken to focus on the pain. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without looking back, I drove out of the parking lot and onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, my mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into my memory. What did he want? What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up? One thing was certain, I would never make the mistake of letting a stranger into my car again. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the silence of my car for a long time, staring out at the empty street. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to fully feel the fear. After resting for a bit, I was scrolling through the web to calm my nerves when I stumbled upon Complaint and wanted reports about a man who looked exactly like the one I had encountered. He was known for tricking people into giving him rides, then using various methods to steal something. He wanted after following his victims. Using the phone number I found in the article, I immediately reported to the local police where I last saw him, right that same night. Thank God, I realized how lucky I was to have escaped that mysterious man and survived. Lucky that the police had been there. Lucky that I hadn't driven him farther and made it home safely. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, "Casey, we need to call the police." Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all.